So remember how I said that the last video was going to be the last?
Liar!
Hello and welcome back. This is Queen3210 and we have more shit apparently. There's a whole section in the game dedicated to files that are unlocked with each successful puzzle or natural story progression. We're no strangers to this. This is a thing in all the Zero Escape games. But what I didn't know was that by beating Zero Time Dilemma, I unlocked more files, including post-payoff epilogues for some of the characters and other tidbits of information that answer some of the questions that I still had in the end. So we're going to go check these out, starting with the epilogue, which I'm honestly not going to read in full detail. I'm just going to summarize it. As interesting as they really aren't, in my opinion, very well written, so I'll just give you the footnotes. For starters, the post-payoffs take place roughly a year and a half after the events of Zero Time Dilemma, so since they've escaped the facility. We start with Carlos, who is spending the day at the beach with his sister Maria, who has since recovered from reverie syndrome. It's not altogether explained how exactly Maria recovered, just that information given to Carlos by Akane helped. I assumed that by knowing Maria is a shifter and therefore was receiving too much information for her brain to process, which left her in a vegetative state, Carlos was able to get her the care she needed. I sure hope he received that money he was promised for joining the decom project. It's a sweet little piece where Carlos acts like a doting older brother and reminisces about Junpei and Akane, who have since become his friends for life. Speaking of whom, in Junpei and Akane's post-payoff, Junpei is writing a letter to Carlos, which may or may not be a wedding invitation. They are technically engaged now, guys, but both Junpei and Akane agreed to hold off the nuptials until the religious fanatic who plans to kill all 8 billion people had been dealt with. Akane sneaks up on him and pokes fun on the fact that he's changed in the last year and a half. He's no longer the sullen and snarky wet blanket that he was during the events of Zero Time Dilemma, and is sort of slowly but surely shifting back to the person that he was when we first met him in 999. Junpei also remarks that there's a future out there where he never actually stopped looking for Akane, the VLR timeline, and that he still can't believe that they are together now like this. On the subject of VLR, there is a short excerpt from the Apocalypse future where the Radical 6 virus was spread. The stars of this little scene are Sigma and a dying Diana after having lived together on the moon for 3 years. There are assurances from Diana that they will both meet again when Old Man Sigma shifts from 2074 to 2028 in order to infiltrate DCOM and stop the spread of Radical 6. It's unclear whether or not she dies in this scene. It kind of feels like she does, but yeah, it's short, it's sweet, but bittersweet. But the biggest surprise of all, though, comes from the remainder of Q-Team's payoff, starting with Mira being incarcerated for her crimes as the Heart Ripper. After they left the decom shelter, Eric convinced Mira, don't ask me how, it's never actually explained, to turn herself in so that she could make it up to her victims and their families. During her incarceration at some point, she and Eric ended up getting married. And she's also smiling for real now, because apparently she doesn't need to plaster a fake smile, probably because she's actually happy. During our check-in, Eric is visiting Mira from behind bars and surprises her with having brought Sean with her. But Sean starts talking about how even though Mira is serving time and trying to make amends for the things she did, she can't actually do that while she's being incarcerated. So, after breaking through the plexiglass divider and knocking out the guards who heard the commotion, because why the fuck not, Sean announces that he knows where they, and I assume by they, we're talking about either the government or Free the Soul, possibly both, is keeping the transporter, and the only way for her to truly atone is if she were to transport herself to the past and stop her younger self from killing her first victim. Except that by breaking out of prison to do this, she's leaving the victims of this timeline without any catharsis, because imagine, if you will, their reaction to learning that the person who killed their loved ones has escaped from prison.
Fuck this guy!
And that's about it for the epilogues. A quick glimpse on what each of the characters involved in the decision game are up to now that they are free again. Well, I mean, when I say free, I obviously don't mean Mira. Up until, you know, Sean came along and like broke her out of jail. Let's just move on. While we're here, let's explore some of the other files that we've unlocked throughout the game. For starters, the answer to one of my questions. So then what happened to the Phi that was sent to 1904? You know, the one that was left behind after her copy data got sent to 2008. Well, according to this file I unlocked, it's rumored that she moved to the United States where she became a brilliant scientist and worked in a research facility, specifically researching the transporter. She, like her brother, lived to be well into her 100s. The file also makes a note that this research facility was where the copy data of Phi was sent to, meaning that it's very likely and altogether extremely plausible that the Phi from 1904 was the researcher who adopted the Phi who transported to 2008. Also, another fun fact, since the Phi from 2028 also mentioned...
That's when an old couple who were researchers took me in.
It stands to reason that either the Phi who lived from 1904 got married, or she opted to co-opt her, co-parent rather, her younger self with someone else, potentially another coworker. Either way, Phi can literally tell everyone that she raised herself. Damn! So it seems that Delta, like Phi, found some interest in Latin. And we know this because he's made some quotes throughout the game. Let's revisit them, shall we? Since, you know, they were never talked about in game. Now, the first phrase comes from when C Team receives 2 votes for execution after the 1330 vote. Roughly translates to fate and the dooming gods are deaf to tears. This one is an interesting one, since later during the Apocalypse fragment, Zero finds it amusing that Akane of all people would invoke God. Brother thinks he's a god, though. This is likely a jab towards her plans for the future, specifically the AB project, which attempts to prevent the spread of Radical 6 and everything she does to ensure its success.
I'm going to need you to forget everything you know, Junpei.
No matter the cost. Specifically looking at the phrase alone, though, it could also be attributed to both Junpei and Carlos, who at some point in their lives fought against fate in trying to rescue Akane in the Nonary game and trying to rescue his sister from the fire and ultimately trying to keep her alive in her vegetative state, respectively, as well as the pain that they suffered while making those attempts. The next Latin phrase is spoken to Q Team, should they be the ones executed after the 1330 vote, and is a lot more straightforward than the first one. Meaning, death is certain, its hour is uncertain, or could be translated to death can happen at any time. This obviously hints at Mira's role as the Heart Ripper, as well as her deal with Zero in that she gets exemption from the drugs in their bracelet. It could also be a nod towards Eric's circumstances with his mother being killed when he was a kid, and then later his father drowning his brother Chris and subsequently forcing Eric to dump the body in the lake, or Eric's father's eventual death due to unspecified illness. Or it could even be a commentary about Zero himself, seeing as how he was present with them as the leader of Q Team. Following the trend set by the first 2 phrases, we get the third from D Team's execution. It's an oldie but a goodie, considering that we've heard this one before in a previous game. Or translated to,
Claude, the play has ended.
This snarky line, said to Sigma by Phi out of spite during the events of Virtue's Last Reward, has come back to bite them both hard in this timeline. But it could also foreshadow one of Zero's main goals here, which was to ensure his and Phi's conception by Sigma and Diana, all the while preserving their related abilities. With them being killed off, this particular play is over. With no more executions to pull from, Zero spends 2 other instances spouting Latin proverbs at his targets. The first being Diana after she presses the button in the decontamination room during the first come first served decision game.
Stop it, Mata Dolorosa.
Translates roughly to the sorrowful mother stood. Obviously, this is referencing Diana's role as mother to Delta and Phi. And the last excerpt is spoken by Zero during the perspective end when choosing to shoot him, specifically Delta, in Triangle.
Addendum Foresca Nuska Ova.
Or Both love and luck help the bold, as it roughly translates to, has no real deep meaning that I've been able to figure out. It could be a nod towards Delta's role as brother, the leader of the Free the Soul cult responsible for the Radical Six epidemic, but that's about as much as I've been able to speculate.
I'd like to tell you an old story.
In the game, we also hear a story that allegedly affected 6 individuals, summed up with an anecdote about how life is unfair. These 6 individuals are as follows: a female jogger, a convicted man and his wife, a genius surgeon and his patient, and a taxi cab driver. The woman was killed in broad daylight while out on a jog, having gone down a different path than she normally does. We learn through a file unlocked during the course of the story that the true killer was a young girl, and during the events of Triangle, we learn that this girl was none other than Mira, the Heart Ripper. This jogger was her first victim. It's also suggested during this confession that Mira was only interested in Eric because she sensed that his heart could give her the same warm, comforting feeling that she has been hunting for since her first victim. And while it's never outright confirmed during Zero Time Dilemma, it is heavily inferred that Mira's first victim, the female jogger, was actually Eric's mother. The woman's last words to Mira before passing were of forgiveness and smiles, the exact same last words from Eric. And given that the woman had taught Eric about smiles and how important it was to always wear one, it's not a stretch of the imagination to make this leap, which means that both Eric and Mira are connected to the death of this woman. But of course, the police never realized the suspect they were looking for was a young girl. So about a month after the woman's body was discovered, the police located and arrested their suspect, catching him quickly before he could escape in a taxi. Instead of the intended fare, a brilliant surgeon requested the cab's services with the intention of taking him to a hospital to treat a seriously ill patient. This cab, unfortunately, participated in a collision with a truck, resulting in the deaths of both occupants. And as the surgeon was no longer able to perform surgery, the ill patient also died. While there's no direct correlation to the cab driver or the surgeon that I can find, we do know that the patient was a good friend of some senior citizen and would often share his academic knowledge in exchange for books. And when the boy died, Delta, revealed to be that senior citizen, modeled his helper bots after the boy named Sean, the same name as the robot participating in the decision game with Q-Team. Of course, we know that the suspect in police custody for the jogger's murder was innocent, and to his final days he proclaimed that innocence. But the verdict was made and they could not overturn his conviction, leading to his execution. He would be posthumously exonerated when DNA proved that he actually was innocent, but didn't really do all that great considering his wife, in her grief, took her own life, leaving behind 2 young children. And these children would be revealed to us by Zero during the Apocalypse fragment as Aoi and Akane Kurashiki, who were later abducted by Cradle Pharmaceutical and forced to play in Honguo Gentaro's Nonary game. The game that may or may not have led to Akane's death if it weren't for Junpei Tenmyoji's forced participation in the Nonary game a decade later. Mira and Eric, Sean and Delta, Akane and Junpei. If we were to disregard Sean, this story explains the presence and participation of 5 of the 9 of the players of the decision game. Each one is linked to the story that Delta presents throughout the course of the game, and therefore a profound relevance to that game beyond their individual actions. Revoking the significance of this story makes everyone apart from Diana, Sigma, and Phi, who were required for an entirely separate reason, feel like extras in a play. And to an extent, that could be said about some of the characters in previous installments of the game. For example, in 999, Clover and Snake were present because they were Espers and could further enhance other Esper abilities, aiding in Aoi and Akane's goal of ensuring Akane's survival during the previous Nonary game. Junpei was instrumental in ensuring Akane's survival, so of course he had to be present too. Ace, the 9th man, the captain, and the Snake body double were there because they were responsible for the Nonary game and the child abductions a decade ago. And 7 was the detective who saved the children aboard the Gigantic. But what about Lotus? Well, she cracked the computer code in the lab that helped to solve the puzzle room and was the one who told Junpei about prosopagnosia. Apart from being the mother of 2 of Hongwo's victims, she doesn't really add much. But even still, despite not being an Esper, she still had something to gain from the whole experience. Closure. She'd been investigating what happened to her kids while trying to spare them the trauma of recalling their experiences. And at least this way, she was able to obtain the answers to the questions she had, even if she had to participate in the same kind of game. Then what about VLR? In that game, the key players were Sigma and Phi, who had to train their shifting abilities from the jump so that they could be prepared for the events of ZTD. To that end, what of the other characters? Both Clover and Junpei, who was going by his last name at this point, were needed for their Esper abilities, specifically to enhance Phi and Sigma's abilities. Luna was both a participant and a partial facilitator. Dio served as the danger element, the unpredictable formula that brought chaos to the experiment. Kay, or Kyle, was a stand-in for Akane, who would act in his stead in the timelines where she wasn't killed by Dio. Apart from Quark, who was simply only there because Tenmyoji didn't want to leave him alone back on Earth, Alice feels somewhat out of place, beyond the usefulness of being able to math as quickly as a goddamn calculator. But much like with Lotus, Alice received closure in being able to find and expose the leader of the group responsible for her father's murder, even if it was several decades after the fact. So where does that leave us for ZTD? If we were to remove Delta's story from the equation, we could look at each individual character's reasons for being in the decom shelter prior to the events of the game. Akane, Sigma, and Phi had infiltrated the base in order to stop the spread of Radical 6. Diana joined to escape her abusive ex-husband. Carlos needed money for a procedure for his sick sister, and the project offered $500,000 to participants. Mira was recruited, which led to Eric's participation. Junpei called in some favors and burned some bridges in order to join up, simply because Akane would be there. And of course, Delta, or Q, joined to instigate and facilitate the decision game itself. Before writing the script for this video, I actually had to stop and wonder about the inclusion of one character in particular, especially after learning the significance of the 17 years ago story. With its inclusion, it became even more glaringly obvious that this one character didn't really belong, and could in fact have been substituted with anyone else, simply because he has no correlation with Delta's story, nor with the reasons that facilitated the need for Sigma, Diana, and to an extent, Phi's participation. And that one person is Carlos. For a while, he was the equation that just didn't make sense, apart from the knowledge that he was a shifter. But even then, no one knew he was a shifter before the start of the game. He was just an extremely perceptive firefighter who knew how to avoid trouble in the eyes of others. You could argue that Delta knew somehow, and had arranged for his participation anyway, and this would be an explanation that makes sense, given Delta's ties to Free the Soul, and the fact that the Mars project was being run behind the scenes by Free the Soul. Now, there is the argument that Carlos at least serves a purpose when compared to Mira and Eric, especially Eric, who are not shifters and don't have the powers the others do. But again, they share a link with the 17-year-ago story, between Mira's being a serial killer and Eric's mother being her first victim. And even more than that is the fact that Mira was purposefully recruited by Delta with no direction beyond do whatever in between Q-Team downtime. And of course, Eric is involved for the same reasons Quark was involved in VLR. The invited individual either didn't want to or couldn't be bothered to leave him behind. And while Carlos's shifting abilities could lead to strengthening other Espers, which ultimately led to everyone, including non-shifters Maria and Eric, being able to shift to the timeline after winning the coin toss, it just doesn't feel nearly as important or as intricate as being an Esper did in the previous games. We've had people learn on the fly regarding their powers before. I mean, Junpei, Sigma, and Phi come to mind here, but they were always irreplaceable cogs in the machine, the pivotal characters that had to be there no matter what. So of course we're going to take the time to train them. Carlos, however, felt different while I was playing the game. And there it is, while I was playing the game. As I'm typing this up on LibreOffice Writer, I've come to realize that there was a very pointed reason why Carlos in particular was chosen for this decision game. And it actually has nothing to do with powers or relevance or anything like that. I mean, they sure as hell helped, and they were ultimately important in the grand scheme of things, but they weren't the big factor in his participation. It was his chosen profession and the actions that come from that profession that have more to do with his relevance than anything else. Because Carlos is a firefighter. He is used to saving lives, and he seems to kind of have a complex about it.
I made a promise in another history that I'd definitely save you two.
You didn't think of stopping Zero's plan?
If I did that, then I couldn't have met you guys, right?
Throughout the course of C-Team's flowchart, he expresses his desire to save lives. During the times he's forced by Delta or otherwise to sacrifice them instead, he's disbelieving, as shown when he votes against the gab ladder when he simply stares at his hands, or after being forced to kill Akane in self-defense after the pantry puzzle, or even the other way when he kills himself believing his body is acting on its own. But the best example of this determination to rescue people is through his repeated shifting and even transporting in all an effort to rescue Junpei and Akane from their fate following their jump from the reactor. His drive to keep them alive ensured his repeated use of the shift ability, which gave him practice, which gave him enough proficiency with the ability to ensure that they were all powerful enough to bring Mira and Eric along with them when they made that last jump. And much like with Lotus and with Alice, there's also the closure aspect of knowing that he is a shifter. Because armed with this knowledge, Carlos was able to help his sister, who is also a shifter, recover from reverie syndrome, as we learned from the epilogue that was explained earlier in this video. This game really makes you think. And when you combine the entirety of the Zero Escape series together, it's like, boom, your head explodes. It is by far and large the most exciting puzzle game series I have ever played, and one that I can't help but find myself thinking about at random times of the day, just trying to piece things together. It's extremely thought-provoking, and I love that aspect when it comes to gaming. But at the same time, there are things about Zero Time Dilemma in particular that I don't enjoy. For starters, let's talk about the flowchart. I hate it. I absolutely despise it. It can go jump in a dumpster fire for all I care. Granted, when you're looking at the global flowchart, it all makes sense, and you can see where all things fit together and the like, and it's much more akin to the flowcharts from the previous game. But the initial screen that game takes you to between chapters is this jumbled mess called the fragments page. And I get it. It's a puzzle piece that you want us to put together, but for first-time players of this game, there's no real way to navigate the natural path of progression of the story without having to look up a guide. And in that case, you run the risk of entering spoiler territory. I like the mindset that was behind this idea of being able to play the game your way and in whatever order you want to, but the execution was really incredibly bad in my opinion. And if you don't agree, that's okay. I'm just telling it how I see it. When I first started playing this game, first attempt with my friend SS Wishbone, we picked the C-Team fragment for the 130 vote, only to think that we jumped ahead after a couple of minutes and that maybe we were supposed to pick one of the other team's fragments first. So we switched to Team D, only to realize that nope, C-Team was the correct choice after all because of the gab letter written by C-Team suggesting we spread the vote. Another example takes place after that vote. For context, when we did the voting, we opted for everyone to follow the gab letter and spread the vote. But when faced with multiple fragments to choose from, we had no real way to tell which was actually the next in sequential order based on that decision. So we moved on to the pantry, where not only did we discover Junpei's dismembered body, that was fun, but the D team had been executed during the vote.
Oh, what happens to the other team?
I suppose the idea is to give us this jumbled, discombobulated feeling that things aren't happening the way we are choosing for them to happen, and therefore we have to change the way that we are thinking. And it worked, so yay, I guess. But it's really jarring to think that your decision actually doesn't matter because you're going to pick a fragment that totally disregards that choice, and fuck you, deal with it. It makes it difficult to follow the story, which is why I ended up posting everything in the order of the flowchart versus everything in the order that I actually played the game. And that, not gonna lie, was a right pain in the ass. But the major thing that kind of spoiled the game for me in regards to the flowchart was my first time running through the transporter room puzzle and subsequently the locker room puzzle with Sigma and Diana. Fun fact, The stranded pair scenario is not unlocked until after you get through the locker room and into the get back scenario, which takes place during the same timeline as the pantry. I simply put it before the locker room puzzle in order of posting the videos, as that's actually how you're supposed to get the password to open the gold door between the locker room and the pod room, otherwise called the door of truth, in order to progress into the get back scenario. But the answer to that particular door is in the stranded pair, which you have to unlock the get back scenario in order to see that password. In the end, I had to look up the answer and risk spoilers. And let's talk about that locker room for a minute. Not the actual puzzle. That shit was fine. I figured out most of that on my own. If you don't know the password and you don't have an earlier save, get fucked, because you are stuck having to repeat either the locker room or the transporter, because all the other paths of the global flowchart are grayed out. And no, redoing the transporter room before you get the option of jumping does not reactivate the other nodes. You are officially fucked and have to start over from scratch because you didn't have the wherewithal to make a separate save before you even so much as looked at the transporter room. Hey, Future Queen here, editing this video together, and I have to disregard the last argument because I'm just a fucking scrub. I didn't notice that the exclamation point underneath the blue timeline that leads to the stranded pair actually does unlock once you hit the puzzle to the door to tomorrow. I'm just not paying attention, so just ignore me. Also, let's talk about how Delta treats Diana in particular, starting with the scenario in which Q-Team escapes the acid showers and is allowed to leave after having received the 6 X passes required to open the elevator. Now, we know he's rather fixated on her, given that in the 0 ending, after he reveals himself and everyone's in the quantum computer room, he mind hacks Eric into murdering Seanbot, Sigma, and then turning the gun onto Eric himself, leaving Diana and him as the sole survivors of the scenario. So, already we know that he views Diana differently than he does, say, Sigma, well, with having killed him off as simply as he did here. But in the ending that follows after the first come first save scenario, Diana runs back to the shelter instead of leaving with Phi and Sigma, and Delta as Zero calls her up and mocks her for coming up with a plan to ensure that she faces no consequences whatsoever for murdering 6 people by pressing a button. A button that I am convinced 100% that Delta forced her to press using his mind hack abilities. And given that each time she's been put in a position to make this sort of decision, she's always confused and often wonders about her decision when it's a decision that leads to the detriment of another team, like, say, C team during the 1330 vote, I'd be willing to wager that, much like Carlos during these 2 incidences, Delta tipped the scales the other way. And with how janky Diana's movements are from the moment she steps onto the elevator to when she rolls under the door to get back into the shelter, I'm inclined to believe that this poor girl had no intention whatsoever of causing these deaths. But what galls me all the more is Delta fucking gaslighting her by suggesting that this is all an act to make herself look less culpable for those deaths, when it wasn't her that was responsible for them, but Delta making her press the fucking button. It just feels like Delta's being a dick here just so that he can be a dick without any rhyme or reason for it, and I'm not about that. Another problem I have narratively is with how the game actually ended.
You are free to decide.
Huh.
Which shall it be? Pull the trigger, or let me go. The fates of you, me, and mankind are all on the line. This is the decision game.
Do I actually have to decide? Oh! Okay. So, the ending is left ambiguous? Delta hands Carlos a gun, who points it, and then we cut to black and roll credits. That alone is bad enough, but I outwardly groaned when I learned through outside sources that not only was there more content in the form of epilogues, but that it was reduced to written form. Not even voice acting.
Boring!
That's extremely disappointing. Because as much as I can envision these scenes playing out in my head, I would have preferred to see them play out post-credits. And I know they don't, because I let those credits roll the entire time before it returned to the main menu option. That's just downright insulting. But the major issue I have with this game is the simple fact that it serves as a conclusion to the Zero Escape games, and yet we feel like nothing at all has been concluded. There are links to the other two games, yes, and we get some answers, of course, like, for instance, what was 67-year-old Sigma doing in 2028 while 22-year-old Sigma was inhabiting his body during the events of VLR? How did Sigma lose his arms and an eye? Which girl was he attempting to save that caused him to lose his arms and an eye? What mission did Phi have upcoming that she was forbidden from talking to Kyle about? What exactly happened in the Mars bunker that led to the Radical 6 outbreak? Who is Brother, and what is his agenda here? Why was it so important for Sigma and Phi specifically to learn how to jump or shift? What happened to the other characters from 999, excluding Clover, who's stuck in the year 2074? But with those answers, we still have some that were left unresolved. Like, what was Kyle's big mission that was alluded to at the end of VLR by Akane? Follow-up, whose mind was using Kyle's body when speaking with Akane while Kyle was participating in his big operation? What exactly did Dio do that got him into so much trouble with Brother and Free the Soul? How did that play out? Who out of the characters in 999 survived the Radical 6 outbreak, excluding Akane, Junpei, and Clover? Who is the religious fanatic who ends up destroying all of humanity and led to Brother unleashing Radical 6 on the world? Follow-up, how do the characters of ZTD plan on dealing with him? Will reoccurring characters come into play here? Is there a way for Quark to exist in any timeline other than the VLR timeline? What kind of life will he lead? Will Junpei be in it? How come Diana and Sigma didn't get an epilogue? What about Phi? How will Mira prevent her younger self from killing her first victim? What kind of timeline will that create? If Delta/Brother's sole purpose is to prevent the religious fanatic from making humanity extinct, why did Dio claim that Free the Soul's goal was to cleanse the world of the impure? Was that just a misinterpretation? Will the truth lead to infighting between Delta and Brother's forces? And the list goes on. Given the fact that Zero Time Dilemma first came out in 2016, and apart from the remaster of the Nonary games in 2017, there's been no word of any sequel games in the making, it stands to reason that ZTD is a series ender. And as a series ender, it fails miserably in its one job to tie up all loose ends, making it, in my opinion, the weakest story of the trilogy. Which is a real shame, because despite my beef with certain parts of the gameplay, it does have the potential to be way more than it already is. The only thing holding it back is that it's the final entry in the Zero Escape series. And as long as that continues to be an undeniable truth, I've pretty much done all I can with this series. It's been a fun ride. Once again, thanks to SS Swishbone for sending this game my way for my birthday. But for now, it's time to say thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the series. If you did, please leave a like or subscribe to the channel for more content. If not, please leave a comment below letting me know what I can do to improve. And, as always, till the next time, guys.